Hello, everyone. We are reconvening our third session on the Transboundary Water series. Thank you so much for joining us. This series is hosted by the Women in Law Initiative in Pakistan and curated by me. Once again, thank you, Nida, for providing a platform for us to have these conversations, particularly about water that is so critical in the current geopolitical landscape. So, our session today is titled Water Rights and Representation Centering Marginalized Voices. Water governance is not simply about managing a natural resource, it is about ensuring that every person has equitable access to one of life's most fundamental necessities. Yet the burdens of water insecurity are not shared equally, and too often the communities most affected by water scarcity, as we saw some of the previous speakers spoke about as well, are the least represented in the decisions that shape water policy and governance. For instance, women, indigenous people, rural communities, low income populations, people with disabilities, and displaced communities are just some examples of those most affected by water scarcity in Pakistan and around the world. Yet their voices remain underrepresented in decisions about how water is allocated, managed, and governed. In light of this, in the last session, we spoke about how water scarcity disproportionately impacts women. Today's conversation will explore the intersection of water, human rights, and environmental justice, asking how law and governance can better reflect the voices and experiences of marginalized communities. By centering those who have historically been excluded from decision making, we hope to examine what more inclusive, equitable, and rights based approaches to water governance can look like. Our speaker today for the session includes Mr. Rafay Alam. Mr. Ahmed Rafay Alam is a Pakistani environmental lawyer specializing in the energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sectors. Mr. Alam teaches climate law and policy at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, where he has also taught me. So, this session is very special for me that way, and has served as chairman and director of several public sector utilities in Pakistan, as well as member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council and the Punjab Environment Protection Council. He is a Yale World Fellow and currently serves as Senior Advisor to Air Quality Asia and as a member of the Hisar Foundation think tank on the rational use of water. Thank you so much for taking out time and joining us for this session, sir. I know you have
Thank
a
you so
very
much for having me, Maham.
very
Thank you so much.
critical.
It's a real pleasure to be here. And again, I want to shout out to Women in Law and Nida for organizing this and appreciate your effort in doing all of this. It's fantastic.
Um, so, sir, we're going to dive right into it. And because our session today is about rights and representation in water governance, to begin with, who do we mean when we talk about marginalized voices in the context of water? And why is it so important that they're included in conversations and decision making about water governance? Because people are still confused as why do you need them at the table?
Yeah. Well, marginalized is it's not too complicated a word. In order to understand it, actually, it's easier to define it in reverse. Well, many years ago, I was doing some work for the United Nations. This was post the earthquake in 2005. And we were trying to come up with an assessment of who are vulnerable or marginalized communities in Pakistan. So we were trying to identify religious minorities, people with physical handicaps, people living in rural areas. And it occurred to us as a group that it would be much easier to define marginalized as anyone who isn't Sunni Muslim, full bodied hair, male living in an urban area in Pakistan. If you're not that, you're marginalized. Right? Or even better, if you're associated with the armed forces. I mean, that's the head of the totem pole, and anything outside that is marginalized. This is important because marginalized voices are ones that aren't really seen. And I think it's really important to understand how that works in water law and governance in Pakistan. And in order to understand that, you have to take a historical overview of where water governance in the Indus Basin, essentially the Indus Basin, comes from. When the British took control of Sindh and Punjab in the 1840s, and then the East India Company was dissolved and the British government took over, there were repeated famines in Punjab, believe it or not, which it forced the British government to build canal colonies and provide arable land to communities so that they could feed themselves. And there was, this was a massive, not just infrastructure project, but a social project as well. Vast areas of Western Punjab, which are now in Pakistan, which were predominantly arid, were provided with canals, and then communities from Jalandhar, from what's now Haryana in Indian Punjab, were then migrated, and these areas were colonized, so to speak. There's actually a Land Colonization Act of 1912, which dictates how that happens. So water was very much thought of as a resource to be exploited, to provide food. And the legislation that came from that, interestingly, by the way, the first bunch of infrastructure that the British built in Punjab and in Sindh was railways and then irrigation. And the Land Acquisition Act was actually enacted so that these two types of irrigation and railway projects could proceed. So once these laws were created to allow the British to build canals, there was canal irrigation acts that were passed, both in Punjab and in Sindh, and actually in all of the provinces. Now, the canal irrigation acts are typically seen as water resource acts. पंजाब में जितना पानी है और जितने वो 12-14 कनाल अंग्रेजों ने बनाए थे, they were all governed by the irrigation acts. Irrigation and Drainage Act in the case of Punjab, which essentially allowed the authorities to acquire land for the construction of a canal, provide compensation to people who are being affected, and then to maintain those canals and provide water to farmers. That was it. That was the extent, more or less, of what the irrigation legislation was and is till this date. But we know that water operates on so many different levels. You take Sindh, for example, which has an irrigation act from 1879. And if you look at the irrigation development in Sindh since the late 1800s, there's vast millions of acres of land, nearly 9 million acres, if not more, acres of land have been brought under irrigation in Sindh since 1932, since the Sakhar barrage was constructed. But even then, over 50% of the land mass of Sindh is outside the Indus Basin. So you can have communities within the Indus Basin that are sort of governed by the rules and practices that have emerged from the irrigation department over the last 100 years, but they have absolutely no bearing in people who live in, say, Thar. On the eastern side of Sindh, there's no per se irrigation over there, no per se water law. So water governance becomes very important, and marginalized communities become much more crystal clear in this sort of scenario, because if you're not part of the irrigation system in Sindh, you're a marginalized voice when it comes to water. And that's why water governance for these communities are so important, because water is a very important fundamental right that all human beings have. And so we need to move beyond the sort of historical framework of water governance in Punjab, which is very blinkered towards irrigation and then subsequently to urban water supply and sanitation. That's the other sort of formal water governance that we have. But folks who are outside the scope of those legislations don't have a voice in how irrigation water, or indeed any water, is provided to them. And we need to re-examine how governance of water can be improved so that people's rights to water can be recognized and protected.
Um, Great, sir, because that actually brings me to another question that I wanted to ask, is that the right to water and sanitation has been now explicitly recognized by the United Nations General Assembly, and it has been elaborated upon by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, because there's something called water for vital human needs that international water law is supposed to protect. So, and now there's a lot of conversation internationally as well to move towards a right based approach to water governance rather than, say, a state to state or an intra or interstate government level. My question is that how do you think that this rights based approach has changed the way we think about water governance, or it can change the way we think about water governance? And what practical difference can it make for particularly marginalized communities?
Good and difficult question. Look, I completely understand that the United Nations and the General Assembly have adopted certain protocols and sort of resolutions with respect to water rights in sanitation and water availability. But as far as Pakistani law is concerned, unless we formally ratify such an international law, it remains a principle that's floating around that we could sort of benefit from, but we don't necessarily have. There has been a lot of action on water law in the provinces in the last decade. For example, in Punjab in 2019, there was a Water Resources Act that was passed, copied by KPK in 2020. Then Punjab updated its 19th century Canal and Irrigation Act with the Canal, Irrigation and Rivers Act of 2023. And in Sindh, which is currently governed by the Irrigation Act of 1879, there are moves to draft and approve a water law, a holistic water law for the 21st century. Now, these legislations in the last 6 or 8 years, I can't say in the case of KPK in Punjab that they reflect the sort of rights-based and water tenure, water governance that we're addressing. Because the the Water Resource Act of Punjab and KPK is a drinking water and sanitation legislation copied from the United Kingdom, which will allow the government of Punjab to authorize water providers and sanitation providers. Interestingly, they're called undertakers in the law. They copied the English legislation where you have water undertakers and sewerage undertakers. And I remember I was arguing a case before the High Court on this law, and it was the first time I think the judge had heard of it. And so I mentioned the fact that, there's a new water regime. The Vasas of Punjab don't have the same authority. So the judge asked, who is it? And I said, they're going to be water undertakers. And he sort of startled and took his glasses off and said, what? Undertakers? Well, anyway, that's what happens when you copy the law without really understanding where it comes from. But nevertheless, you have water providers and sanitation providers which will be licensed to do so. Things like housing schemes, things like farming as well. And it's an attempt to move from what we call the riparian doctrine of water law, which existed in Punjab and KPK until this legislation happened, which is very simply, if you own land, you own the aquifer underneath it. Right, a very, very powerful principle of law that stood from because of the Easements Act, incidentally. The Easements Act says, Section 7G says that if you own land, you own the water underneath it, which was one of the primary water rights that we had throughout Pakistan. But I mean, it had its limitations. You had to own land to have a right to the water underneath it. And secondly, if you own the land, the water underneath it was free, which incidentally is why Nestle Pure Life as a brand originated in Pakistan. Its plant in Sheikhupura in the Rachna Doab extracts over 220 million liters of water every single year, puts it into indestructible plastic bottles, and then sells it to us. And if you ask Nestle how much they pay the government of Pakistan or the government of Punjab or the district government of Sheikhupura for the privilege of accessing this natural resource, the answer is zero, because if you own the land, you own the water underneath it. You're just paying for the cost of the tube well and the reverse osmosis process that they have. So it's an incredibly profitable system. But that riparian formula of water ownership had to be improved on. So what these two legislations essentially do is they nationalize all water resources. So in KPK in Punjab, all groundwater, all surface water, ponds, streams, what have you, the water is vested in the province. And the provinces have to come up with a regulatory mechanism to then allocate this water in an equitable way, incidentally. And these two legislations also provide a priority of water usage. So in an equitable way to different priorities of usage. The laws are now 5 or 6 years old, but have hardly been acted upon because of the incredible institutional strength of the irrigation departments that preceded the legislation. These irrigation departments would have to transform themselves from merely controlling the canals to understanding water governance at a provincial level. Take the irrigation department of Punjab, for instance, which controls, I think, 19 barrages and a number of canals. But they have absolutely no idea of what water resources, say, in Murray are like. In a hill area outside the irrigation system. So the department itself would have to transform. These are fantastic opportunities, I think, these transformations where we can learn from these United Nations principles that you're talking about so that the regulatory mechanisms that are rolled out in these two provinces can benefit from them and provide equity to marginalized voices. The case of Sindh is slightly different because the law drafting group is headed by this fellow called Steve Hodson, who's an international water lawyer who incidentally specializes in something called water tenure assessments, which is a mechanism that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations uses to identify the rights and relationships people have to water before you set out and make legislation. So the draft Sindh water law should benefit from these principles, provided, of course, it's approved by cabinet and passed by the Sindh Assembly. So we are at a stage now in water law where we can really benefit from these sort of international principles, but we have to resist the sort of old institutional memory of these old departments who are very, very sort of fixed in their ways and don't want to move beyond the silos that they've created over the last century.
Sir, when we talk about, like, when you've spoken, given the Sindh example, and we have spoken about marginalized communities, in particularly in, you've given us a general definition, but in particularly in Pakistan, which communities do you believe are most vulnerable to water insecurity, and what do you think is the biggest, say, legal, political, or institutional barriers preventing their voices from being heard in decision making? So, like, for North indigenous populations facing a lot of challenge because of that. But in Pakistan, who would you say are the most affected, and what do you think are the issues in bringing them to the table?
Well, as you know just as well, water operates on different scales. So if you're looking at irrigation water, there's a set of laws and policies. When you're looking at drinking water, it's different. When you're looking at streams and water resources like Manshar Lake in Sindh, a different set of principles. It's very difficult to say generally who is vulnerable. There's vulnerability in water anywhere, right? You take Lahore, for example, where the Lahore elite are uniquely placed in the world, living in a city in a third world country where they hardly pay for the water in their showers. They don't even know what the rate of water is. But in the same city, you will have vast tracts of land and millions of people who don't have access to clean drinking water. So vulnerabilities can change with geographies within kilometers. Lahore's vulnerability of lack of access to clean drinking water is because it's in the Bari Doab, and the Bias and the Ravi have been allocated to India under the Indus Water Treaty, and the population of Lahore, which predominantly uses groundwater, has moved from 900,000 at partition to over 10 million today. So there's massive strain on the water resources, which creates marginalization. But if you cross the Ravi and get into the Rachna Doab between the Ravi and the Chenab, you'll find fresh water at 35, 40 feet, which incidentally is what Nestle benefits from. So vulnerabilities change, marginalization changes as well. Right, so you can have marginalized communities in low-income areas in Lahore that don't have access to clean water. But if you go up north, for example, to Gilgit-Baltistan or to KPK, the fellow on the top of the mountain has more control of water than the fellow at the bottom of the mountain, because you can have these spate dams that prevent water from flowing down. And so vulnerabilities and marginalization can be created there as well. So I can't give you a holistic example of what the most vulnerable communities when it comes to water is, because water operates at different levels, and at every level there will be a vulnerability and there will be a marginalized community. That said, the living conditions of the people in Tharparkar, or generally the people outside the Indus Basin, in vast areas of Balochistan, in western Punjab, and in eastern Sindh, have no firm source of water. These are people who live off ponds that collect water when it rains or that come off these hill torrents, and which water is hardly purified and is shared with animals. That's just in the 21st century just makes me shiver with disgust and revulsion that we can't do anything about this because our water legislation is focused towards primarily irrigation and not to the benefit of these communities. So that's my answer there.
I think that's a very harrowing thing to hear for most people, and I think a lot of people are not aware of the extent
They're
of
not. You're
the
absolutely right. I was
problem.
I was teaching a summer school in Lums a few weeks ago. And some of the kids wouldn't believe
Yeah.
that this was the case. I had to show them a documentary. It literally shows people and animals drinking together and give you a sense of how privileged, well, give them a sense of how privileged they are, and how marginalized other communities can be.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. You'd mentioned women are even marginalized here. In these communities, in Thar, for example, it's the women who go out and get the water. They have to wake up, walk miles, and bring these heavy matkas back to the house so that their families can have a little bit of
Yeah.
water for their domestic needs. It's just, it's what's the word I'm looking for? Medieval.
That's very, very harrowing. But enter on that level, we know if there are people who are marginalized otherwise as well. But then there are issues such as climate change, which is intensifying floods, droughts, and water scarcity around the world. So, m- building on to what you previously spoke about, how do these environmental challenges intersect with questions of inequality and justice? And why is it important that climate adaptation strategies prioritize these people as well? Because in countries, even in Pakistan, there are still conversations whether all of these are part of one issue or they need to be, like, say, dealt with separate ministries. And when one is like has no clue what the other is doing, why do you think an integrated approach is important?
Well, climate change is affecting everything. That's true. Even today, happen to be in Islamabad, where it rained last night, and horrible news in Rawalpindi and in parts of Islamabad, where hip deep water in many communities, flooding them. And this is across the board between low income areas and the Beria town of Islamabad. Cars are sunk. But there was someone on social media who was talking about growing up in Rawalpindi in the 80s and 90s and remembering immense monsoon rains, but never any flooding. Um, and I think it's just our urban template in the 21st century that ignores that water will find its own course and builds these sort of housing schemes and things in the path of water, which are the cause of so much suffering in the urban areas. But this is not to forget, it is the rainy season, and there's flooding up north. There's flash flooding. Flash flooding is defined as a certain amount of rain falling in a certain amount of area in a certain amount of time. It's like 100 millimeters in 3 hours or something like that. There's some definition of it. And so what happens up north is when it rains so intensely, the water comes cascading down the sides of the mountains and into these little streams that become raging torrents within minutes. And communities hardly have, 10, 15 minutes of preparation to get everything and their animals and their belongings to high ground before destruction comes. So we're seeing the impacts of climate change in terms of floods in Pakistan almost every single year. And yet, at the same time, every single year, there is a heat wave before the rain, and each year is hotter than the last. This is the coolest summer for the rest of your life, as it were. So we're beginning to see these strains. Now, why is it important to consider these things holistically? Because, and whether or not even it's possible to do so, is because when these climate shocks happen, when a climate event happens, it's well known. I mean, this is why we use the word vulnerable or resilient when it comes to climate change. That resilience is actually measured on a scale of affluence. The richer you are, the more resilient you are. The less rich you are, the less resilient you are. The less ability you have to get back on your feet if an event happens. I'm very lucky to live in a brick home. Agar barish hoti hai, I'm well and good. But if I lived out in, say, Alipur in South Punjab, and I live in a mud hut and it rains, my house is gone. Or if it floods, the road connecting me to the market is gone. My son's school is swept away. The hospital or clinic is swept away, which takes years and years and years to rebuild. So the impacts on climate of these climate events, these water-related climate events on less affluent, more vulnerable, more marginalized communities are magnified because of the amount of time it takes to rebuild these communities. A year and a half ago, I visited parts of Sindh to see what sort of reconstruction efforts had been undertaken after the 2022 floods. This was in Early 2025, I went, and I was surprised to find there were many, many villages that still hadn't got their roads repaved, let alone the electricity, for example. And so you have people living in, again, medieval conditions in modern Pakistan that, because of these climate change events, have been severely impacted. So that's why it's so important, because we are a poor country. You have to understand. There well over 200 million of us, and right now, approximately 35% of that population is at or near the poverty line, which basically translates to unable to feed themselves once a day. With that large a proportion of your population suffering, you need to move beyond your sort of siloed irrigation and drinking water focused legislation to really open up the eyes of water law to see what people's rights are and to actually protect them. So that's why, in the age of climate change, you have to have a holistic view of a water law.
Definitely, sir, because I feel like even in Pakistan, having worked there as well, I do feel like we're very siloed out from issues because of a ministerial thing as well. Or this ministry works with this, so this is not really our domain. And then a lot is left to chance. So, similar to climate change, conflict, we've also seen conflict erupt all over the world. And whether during armed conflict or political instability, displacement and tensions over shared waters erupt with that. And again, a lot of academics say that vulnerable communities are often the first to experience disruptions in their access to water. Like you said, like if you're rich, your ability to get back on your feet, even if you live in a conflict zone, is more. So the idea is that how do you think legal and governments, and particularly legal frameworks, can ensure that their rights and basic water needs remain protected during particular situations of armed conflict like we're seeing around the world?
Um, that what's very interesting is that in the history of conflict, now I have looked this up, by the way, water is actually very seldom been used as an instrument of aggression. And Undala Alam of the United Kingdom did a PhD on this. She talks about this concept of water rationality, that water is too serious to fight over. Water is something that you negotiate over. There are, of course, notable exceptions, especially in the 21st century and the late 20th century. And it's a handful of countries. And I bet you can guess which one of them is the worst. It happens to be exercising a genocide in Gaza. So, other than that, these few exceptions, people generally come and negotiate on water. Um, so I can't, I mean, conflict does drive displacement, and displaced people are, by definition, marginalized, might not have access to water in the ways that they were used to. But I want to turn that your question just a little bit, because there are conflicts on water in Pakistan that happened even this year. In May of this year, the chairman of the Sindh Irrigation and Drainage Authority, SIDA, which is a participatory authority attached to the irrigation department that allows farmers to make decisions about their use of water and needs of water. The chairman of SIDA actually called for the resignation of the chairman of the Indus River System Authority, the authority that implements the water record. Called for his dismissal on account, they said, of a 40% reduction in water flows in Sindh over the course of April and May. That was a potential conflict. I mean, you could tell that there was the boilings of conflict going on over here. And the reason I mention this is, when it comes to these sorts of conflicts, we in Pakistan, because this Sindh Punjab thing happens all the time, right? And it's going to exacerbate within districts. And if we have more provinces, oh my God, you know what no one is talking about right now? Everyone's talking about how Pakistan's governance can be improved by a constitutional amendment increasing the number of provinces. अरे भाई, चार सूबे अपने पानी का बंदोबस्त ठीक नहीं कर सकते, तुम 15 और लेकर आ रहे हो. How will governance improve in Pakistan by doing that? But that's a digression over there. So when it comes to these sorts of water conflicts, for instance, on the water apportionment accord, I'm more interested in dispute resolution mechanisms that need to exist. So what are the if there's a dispute or a conflict on water, what can you do to resolve it? Right? And what's really shocking is that we have very few dispute resolution forums for these sorts of water disputes. We've got the Council of Common Interests that looks at any province that feels that its water resources are being prejudiced by something can file a complaint to the Council of Common Interests. That's one forum that you have. But that forum isn't available to Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir because they're not provinces. Nor is that forum available to any individual. It has to be the province or the Islamabad Capital Territory that files a complaint. And moreover, since its inception in 1973, the Council of Common Interests has been referred no more than 4 complaints on water and has never resolved any of them. And the various historical accidents why they haven't. So, as a lawyer, I feel deprived of case law and precedent because case law and precedent helps me tell my client what the future is going to be with some certainty. And you can resolve disputes and you can lessen tensions and conflict if you have precedent before you, if you have a forum before you. We don't have that forum. We don't have anything when it comes to interprovincial water adjudication other than the Water Apportionment Accord, which is almost 30 years old now. It's over 30 years old now. The Water Apportionment Accord operates on the basis of averages. They're taking these averages of water demands in the provinces between 1977 and 1982. That was after Tarbela was commissioned, Pakistan's last big storage. So the allocations are dependent on that, on averages that are 30 years old in the age of climate change. And as my friend Danish Mustafa and mentor says, there are no averages in the age of climate change. There's only extremes. So the one conflict resolution mechanism or forum that we have hasn't actually produced any precedent. And the only sort of legal document which you can say is an accord on water is outdated and is unfit for purpose in the climate age. So in these circumstances, I worry because without these sort of effective conflict resolution mechanisms and forums, water conflicts will exacerbate. And that's what I'm more worried about.
And we've already seen them exacerbating, particularly in Africa as well. So there are a number of situations where border conflicts have become very, very severe because of
You're absolutely
Africa,
right. And in South America as well, there have been massive conflicts as well. Absolutely. Absolutely.
on both the quantity and quality of water, which is a separate conversation. So, sir, coming on to your own experience a bit, you do a lot of public interest litigation. So, as an environmental lawyer, you've worked on environmental rights related to environmental protection and resource protection generally. In your experience, what role can the legal system and courts play in protecting the rights of marginalized communities and ensuring more equitable water governance, particularly in a country like Pakistan?
Well, I no longer practice interest litigation after the 26th and 27th Amendments because it's impossible to do so. I was speaking to Abdullah Malik, who's another colleague from the High Court here today. He and I were lamenting this fact. But in the past, when after the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of academic writing about how the three state institutions you've got your judiciary, your executive, and your legislature. Your legislature and executive being caught up in this civil-military conflict since the beginning of partition really left the judiciary with no other option but to do as much as they could in recognizing and protecting rights because the other two arms of the state weren't delivering the sort of promises that they were supposed to. So that's really where public interest litigation emerges from. And it has made immense amounts of difference in terms of identifying rights. The 26th Amendment introduces Article 9A, which says that everyone is entitled to a clean and healthy environment and sustainable development. But that was what was said by Justice Salim Akhtar in the Shaila Zia case back in 1994. He reinterpreted Article 9 of the Constitution, which says that no person can be deprived of life or liberty unless in accordance with law. And if you're losing your life on account of bad environment, that's a violation of your Article 9 rights. So, I mean, that's been enjoined in there for quite a while. And that judgment itself, by the way, was so powerful it's more or less created environmental jurisprudence in Pakistan. There have been a number of cases since that have recognized the right to clean drinking water as a fundamental right, that have recognized the right to clean air as a fundamental right, even the right to access to electricity as a fundamental right, which incidentally will become more important as cities become increasingly unlivable because of global warming. Um, there can be immense changes that the judiciary can bring about by decision making on what rights exist. And they have done so. The Pakistani judiciary has been amazing in identifying new environmental and human rights and then protecting them on behalf of extremely marginalized communities. I mean, the Sheila Zia case itself was a letter written to the Supreme Court that was converted into a petition. I must also add, Sheila Zia was a lawyer and a women's rights activist that helped found Pakistan's first all women's law firm, the AGHS Law Associates. A for Asma Jahangir, G for Gulrukh, H for Hina Jilani, Asma Jahangir's sister, and S is Sheila Zia. So I just want to point out that Pakistan's first big environment case was brought by a feminist. And you'll find again and again around the world where environmental rights are being sought to be protected, it's usually angry mothers and a feminist movement behind them. Anyway, that's the Sheila Zia case, which demonstrates the potential of what can be done. But, and this is a very important but, somewhere along the line, public interest litigation became a panacea for all ills. And I don't know what happened to us where we started thinking that the courts could solve everything. And my hard learned experience is that courts of law adjudicate rights. They're not really there to clean the air, to clean the water, or provide access to drinking water. That's not the function of a judiciary. It's not the way it was designed, and it can't deliver on that. And so, equally, there have been a number of public interest litigations. And I refer to the Chaudhary Iftikhar court, the huge amount of suo motos that took place, and even the Saqib Nisar court in 2018. There were a huge number of environmental cases he took on, especially regarding drinking water in Cura and the salt range. Um, which did not, even one of them, make a dent in jurisprudence. They were just administrative orders, but no elaboration as to rights. So, while there is an immense potential for courts to determine rights and allow litigants to come and protect those rights, we've seen in the last 10, 15 years courts moving away from an elaboration of what the rights are. There are notable exceptions. There are several great judgments by Mansoor Ali Shah on climate change and on air pollution. But by and large, you see judges basically taking on the role of a water and sanitation agency or the Environment Protection Agency and then issuing administrative orders as to do cleanup and stuff like that. That's not effective. That doesn't work, and it won't work either. So while there is immense amount of potential, the practice of public interest litigation in the last 5, 10 years has sort of changed track. And now PIL doesn't exist because of the federal court.
Which is a very unfortunate thing, because I feel like for particularly resource and environmental justice, it was one of the best routes to bring at least issues out there or part of the conversation. But sir, on that note, like with the issues that are inherent in Pakistan, looking beyond Pakistan, there are examples from other countries where marginalized communities have been successfully included in decisions about water allocation and governance. On the top of my head, the Arctic comes to mind, and indigenous community, the Arctic, the governance of the Arctic and indigenous communities really pushed for it. They were just like, "You, there's no way we're going to let you govern this without our say in it." What lessons from these experiences could Pakistan adapt to make it its own water governance systems more inclusive and participatory?
In the 1990s, the World Bank advised the governments of Punjab and Sindh to have participatory water management introduced into the canal and irrigation systems. So these irrigation and drainage legislations were passed in 1997, the Punjab one, PIDA, and the Sindh one, SIDA. The Sindh Irrigation and Drainage Authority Act of 1997 was amended by an ordinance in 2002, and it was supposed to control all 14 of Sindh's canals. But like I said, the tendency of the department not to relinquish control has meant that even though the legislation allows for participatory management of the entire canal network in Sindh, there are not more than 3 canals that are under participatory management right now. There's almost a resistance to let people decide for themselves, as if to think they don't know enough. And when it comes to Punjab, the Punjab Irrigation and Drainage Authority Act was completely repealed in 2002 because the irrigation department did not want to have, bottoms up control when it comes to water. And so it seems to me that there is a resistance to recognize the rights of people. It's as if these departments or these agencies say we are responsible, we know best, and bus up, go to hell. We will. You don't know enough. This requires a fundamental rethink. Water is not just about irrigation and providing people drinking water. Water is far more things. Access to water is far different when it comes to canal areas as opposed to non-canal areas. And we need to have a language in law that speaks about both. We have to have a language of law that recognizes that, people, farmers on the head of a canal are better placed and better privileged to have access to water compared to farmers at the tail end of canals who hardly get their allocations. We need to have a system that recognizes this and responds to this. And we have to get over our fear of democracy, almost, as it were. This idea that you bloody pores, you can't think of anything. That's not true in my experience. Farmers know best how to use water. You might as well listen to them and have an interesting and equitable allocation system. In the case of Sindh, by the way, I was talking about how Sindh is evolving its new water law. So one of the drafts of the water legislation that was put to the irrigation department allowed for every person receiving water from a irrigation outlet to have a water allocation certificate. A piece of paper which tells you that I have a right to 0.0002% of the volume of water in this canal. And that would give people enforceable rights to water. When that was put in the draft, the irrigation department specifically asked to have it taken out. They said that's too radical. We're not going to do that. We're going to continue our system of sort of rotations, and we'll try our best. Right now, don't try and do anything too technical or too advanced. And it goes back to that fear. And I don't know how to resolve that. I don't know how to overcome that. That's a completely different, systems alteration theory that's beyond my knowledge.
That's again interesting to hear, because I feel like a lot of people would not have been aware of that. And sir, on the note of learning from other people's experiences, we international organizations play a major role in water governance, or at least they unsuccessfully try to, as we've seen with the World Bank as well. So it's now clear that in the water governance arena, governments are not the only actors. So, so according to you, and with your experience in resource management, what role can international organizations and largely the civil society as well play in amplifying marginalized voices and overall strengthening water governance?
They can play an immense role. The ADB and the World Bank can put conditions on financing. They can say that, we're not going to give you money unless you have, 30% women on a water council, for instance. And that's a very powerful tool that they have. The United Nations, when it comes in and does flood relief or post-disaster relief, often leads by example in the rehabilitation process, in the reconstruction process. So provincial governments and federal governments can learn what best available practices exist, especially when it comes to rehabilitating mostly marginalized communities impacted by floods and climate disasters, on what can be done. So, for instance, in Bonaire last year, where there was a flash flood, I mean, almost half of the 800 people who died in KPK flash flooding last year came from Bonaire, just the district in Bonaire, and the flash flooding that took place there. And I read maybe today or yesterday on the UNDP's page that they have successfully rehabilitated several hundred homes with now, water storages, solar pumps, filtration systems. And so that is a clear example of how to move forward as well, and what available technologies are here in the market for the government to use for the benefit of its citizens as well. So yes, they can play an immense role, absolutely. And civil society as well needs to play a role, because as skeptical as I may sound, or cynical as I may sound, I do believe that governments, including the government of Pakistan and our provincial governments, they can do things. I mean, I've seen them happen. You want a road, सड़क बन जाती है. You want a hospital, अस्पताल बन जाता है. You want a school, school बन जाता है. But you got to ask for it, right? People ask for the school, they ask for connectivity to the market, and they get a road. That's what the constituency asks for. The constituency has to ask for their, not just clean drinking water, but for their rights in water, and for their rights to be recognized. And also to understand that some of the conditions that our marginalized communities live in aren't inherent, they're not God given, that they are very, very cheap, very, very readily available solutions to improve the quality of their lives and the access they have to clean and better improved quality water.
uh, Along the same lines, sir, there was a question that came. So a lot of people send us questions in the registration form as well, because they just want it answered, and may not be able to ask it themselves. So, and it's similar to the one I just asked. It says that what kind of work can grassroots community organizations or NGOs or civil society organizations do to adopt a rights based approach to promote equitable access to water and more sustainability focused decision making in the context of Pakistan?
Okay.
So basically, what can organizations or grassroots level organizations do to promote equitable access?
Um, I think what Pakistan needs is what's called a water tenure assessment. And I've actually made this proposal to the International Water Management Institute, and which has set up a Pakistan panel on transformative futures to do a water tenure assessment of all of Pakistan. That would be every single province, to see what sort of relationship people have in those provinces to water, and then start identifying what is a legal right, what is an equitable distribution from that type of assessment. So I think a water tenure assessment exercise for Pakistan would be the eye-opening event that can lead to improved governance. Now, at the same time, I have to caution these civil society organizations and grassroots organizations, because changing the way water is used in Pakistan requires an understanding of how that use came to be. And I remember at the beginning of our talk right now, I was telling you how the canal and irrigation system started as a British colonial experiment, expanded after partition through the assistance of the World Bank. But essentially, that water was used for irrigation. And right now in Pakistan, we have, according to the water policy, over 90%, some say 92% of the water resources in Pakistan are used for agriculture. And the remaining 8 or 10% somehow is shared between industry and domestic use. This is what we're told. And so I'm believing this to be correct, although I've been reading this figure for the last 15, 20 years, and these percentages don't change. So I'm beginning to wonder, because, I mean, with the increase in population, there has to be conflict between industrial use and domestic use at some level. Those percentages have to change. But nevertheless, we're taking 90% of our water and putting it into agriculture. Now, Pakistani agriculture produces all sorts of goods, food goods, agricultural goods, cash crops as well. But we produce four major goods: cotton, rice, sugar, and wheat. And these four products consume the vast proportion of that 90%. Over half of that 90% of water goes to these four crops. Okay, now you take, for example, cotton. Cotton, it takes what? 20, no, it takes 10,000 liters of water to produce a kilo of cotton. It's a water intensive production, well, growth and production system. But the textile industry, the cotton industry, the textile industry in Pakistan employs about 25, 30 million people, and generates immense amounts of dollars in terms of textile exports out of Pakistan. So we put that to the side, and I'm going to put wheat to the side as well, because it's a food crop, a necessary food crop. I want to focus on rice and sugar. So it takes about 2,200 liters of water to produce a kilogram of rice. A grain of rice is basically tightly packaged water, and rice is grown underwater as well. It's again a water-intensive crop. And we actually export more rice out of Pakistan than we consume within Pakistan. So if you produce 6 million tons of rice a year, over 3 million goes abroad. It goes to Iran, it'll go to Africa, it'll go to the Middle East. Um, and there are about 250, 300 export enterprises in Pakistan that engage in this activity. Just keep those numbers in mind. And now come to sugar. Sugar takes about 1,800 liters of water to produce a kilo of sugar. There are about 100 sugar mills in Pakistan. They're owned by 45 people. Okay? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The individual who owns the most number of sugar mills in Pakistan right now is currently the president of Pakistan. And the family that owns the largest number of sugar mills in Pakistan currently has a member of their family as the prime minister of Pakistan. The family that owns the second largest number of sugar mills in Pakistan used to be the chief minister of Pakistan and runs a political party. See what I'm getting at? And these people are disproportionately powerful. Now, we here in Pakistan are told, oh, 2025 tak pani khatam ho jayega. We're going to become water scarce. All right. Remind you that in 2025, last year, we were in deep flood around about this time. Okay. So what's happening is we have an immense amount of water that's being used by a handful of, being used to produce a handful of crops, which are benefiting a very small number of industries and individuals. Okay. If you want to improve water governance in Pakistan, you have to understand how this political economy of water is operating right now. It's allowing a small number of people to make immense amount of profits and consume most of the water resource in Pakistan. और फिर हमें कहते हैं कि आप क्या कहते हैं प्यासे मरने वाले हैं. Go ask the Rice Exporters Association of Pakistan. Go ask APTMA if there's a water shortage. As a matter of fact, the Pakistan Sugar Mill Association in May of this year wrote a letter. The chairman of the Pakistan Sugar Mills Association is a fellow called Zaka. He used to be the chairman of the cricket board. Um, and he owns several sugar mills. He wrote a letter to the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Dar, saying that the sugar industry in Pakistan had produced an excess of sugar beyond our demand for this year. I forget exactly how much. It's several hundred million tons or something. It's an insane amount of overproduction, which when you calculate the amount of water consumed was 2% of the water resource in Pakistan. And they were seeking permission to export that sugar so that they can generate revenue for Pakistan. Look, you don't need to make these people any richer. They need to produce less sugar so that more water is available to people. So, if you understand the water economy of Pakistan, you understand the changes that need to be made. We don't need to continue living like this, using 90% of our water for agriculture. ये तो अंग्रेजों के ज़माने का design था. We have an immense amount of water. We don't have to produce the amount of sugar we do. We don't have to export that rice. We don't need to use sort of the type of irrigation, flood irrigation for rice. There's different ways of growing rice. We can save that water resource by changing our practice, and Pakistan would have plenty of water for the rest of its people. And so it's beyond just recognizing, doing an exercise on water tenure and seeing what rights people have, because the rights people are able to exercise now is heavily dependent on the institutional history of our use of water and the political economy of water. And that needs to radically transform. It takes about 100,000 liters of water to produce a SUV, one of these sort of big cars. Believe it or not, it's virtual water exercise. Everyone's done an exercise. They tell you how much water it takes to produce a product. So it's upwards of 100,000 liters to produce a large car. I mean, Pakistan could use its water resource to produce large cars and export them. But you need a vision for that and 50 years to do it and an educated engineering workforce to achieve it. अभी जो हम हैं हम कह रहे हैं कि जी 90% पानी हम खेती बाड़ी में लगाएंगे जहां लोग गरीब रहते हैं और अनपढ़ रहते हैं और ये हमें ठीक लगता है. This is not correct. We have to rethink at a fundamental level how precious our water resources are in this climate insecure world and in what equitable way they can be put to use for the benefit not just of people but of the political economy of water as well.
Sir, on that level, like the fact that water is so important, we've gotten another question for you as well, and all of these are questions that the participants have sent us. Why have we not recognized the right to clean drinking water as a fundamental right in our constitution then? clearly it's so important for survival.
Well,
So
the Cura salt minor case of 1994 declared that clean drinking water is a fundamental right. The same Justice Salim Akhtar who penned the Shaila Zia judgment. So, yeah, in my opinion, you don't need a constitutional amendment to secure that, right? You already have that by virtue of a Supreme Court decision. And so, if anyone in Pakistan feels that their right to clean drinking water, their right to availability of clean drinking water is being compromised, go to court.
yeah. Um, Sir, we have another question in the chat. Kashif Gul has asked, and I'm reading it out. Sir, as an environmental lawyer, what is your opinion about the improper system of environment from water supply to road construction? Is the only government who is responsible for this condition of environment, especially in Sindh?
Hmm. Is this improper system of environment from water supplies one section to road construction to another, or is it water supplies for road construction? I'm slightly confused. But
I Kashif is here. Let me just check.
but
If you would like
I've
to
had the
clarify.
great privilege of traveling extensively in Sindh, and I have to say that the relationship the people of Sindh have with the Sindhu River is exceptional. There's not a person you'll find within the Indus Basin irrigation system in Sindh that doesn't have a deep economic, social, and personal connection with the river. It's really very special. And unfortunately, within the Indus Basin system, the irrigation department of Sindh is the monopolist. Unki baat chalti hai. No one else is really heard. So if there's any sort of deficiencies in water supply, uh, it primarily comes to the shoulders of the irrigation department and subsequently onto the shoulders of the housing urban development department, which does the drinking water supply systems for urban areas. So those are primarily responsible. And as far as the roads are concerned, I really don't know. I live in Lahore. But I did learn something interesting about the roads of Karachi, which, if people live in Karachi, will sympathize, are in terrible state. There's not a single road in Karachi that doesn't have massive potholes in it. And incidentally, that has something to do with water. Because a lot of drinking water in Karachi is provided by tankers. वो टैंकर माफिया की बात करते हैं. So you also see in Karachi all these water tankers on highways and in roads providing residences with water. But the problem with these tankers is that it's such an easy solution. It's an empty hull. The tank of a water tanker is an empty hull that's carrying water, and as the tanker slows down or accelerates, the water in the back splashes back and forth, and it causes the truck to jump, to rise up and down, which creates this pressure on the road, which in turn breaks it and exacerbates the condition of the road. So, one way of fixing the roads in Karachi is to have piped water supply. Would be interesting, believe it or not. And also, you can engineer a solution yourself out of that problem by having these cuts in the hull that can prevent the water from slushing around too much. So I don't know. I hope I understand the question properly, because that's the only answer I can think of right now.
Uh, I think no, I'm he's here. So if he wants to ask a follow up question, does anyone want from the audience? We're going to open the floor now for the audience to ask questions. Does anyone have a question from the audience, or does anyone have a comment that they would like to say?
I think Alton
I
left a
Okay.
comment earlier in the chat. You might want to read that out.
Yes, sir. Altamash left a comment and he said that I believe you had mentioned that the AK Brohi village in Sindh did not get an assessment and hence no housing rehabilitation even on paper after the floods. Most of the housing offered on paper wasn't inclusive to persons with disabilities.
That's just scratching the surface. Um, Look, the 2022 floods were an exceptional event, especially in Sindh and Balochistan, where a 100-kilometer lake was produced over the course of 2 weeks. This water had no place to go. It was outside the Indus Basin, so it didn't have anywhere to drain. Um, and upwards of 10 million people between Sindh and Balochistan were affected, impacted, and in many cases displaced. Now, in the days and weeks following, you have to understand we're a poor country. Uh, I met with district officers, for example, in Larkana, who said that the rain was so intense on several days in August 2022 that they couldn't see 10, 15 feet out and were unable to go out in the field to do any sort of rescue and rehabilitation. So that's the sort of chaotic condition that existed. It was really, really difficult and immensely flooded. And so, between whatever resources the government of Sindh could muster and the Pakistani army, an assessment was done of who suffered what damage where. Now, in any chaotic situation, there are going to be mistakes. And there were many mistakes made. So, for example, one of the things they did when they were looking at impacts, they would only if your house was totally destroyed, then you were eligible for relief. If it was partially destroyed, you weren't. If somehow or the other you'd left your home and gone to a city during the flood, you were accepted or left outside of any reconstruction and rehabilitation efforts because you were considered better off than other people. So you have to understand that the conditions that existed at the time and the many mistakes that were made resulted in huge amounts of people not being considered for rehabilitation work or rehabilitation funds. And the government of Sindh has since taken a massive loan from several multilaterals, World Bank, Asian Infrastructure Bank, ADB. Um, Last I knew, it was $1.2 billion to do these flood reconstruction homes. And a lot of what the first phase of this reconstruction has faced has been a consequence of the mistakes that were made in the past. A lot of people were excluded from homes being considered being built. And I hope that in the second phase of this housing project that the government of Sindh is sponsoring, that those mistakes can be addressed and rectified and improvements can be made. I mean, you have to understand it was an exceptional event, and we had very limited resources and mistakes were made, and we're now living with the consequences of those mistakes. But those mistakes came for a reason. They weren't malicious as such. And I just hope that as we learn and do this again and again, and we will be doing it again and again, there will be more floods, that we do it better and much more equitably and much more quicker, and expand the scope of relief from these sort of almost arbitrary distinctions. आधा घर गिरा है, पूरा घर गिरा है, शहर गए थे, नहीं शहर गिरे थे. These are arbitrary. Damage is damage. Compensation is compensation. It doesn't matter otherwise.
Thank you, sir. I have a final question to ask to wrap up. There are a lot of people who are going to be listening to this who are young lawyers thinking about careers in water or environmental governance. What what would you say is the viability of such a career in Pakistan and internationally? And if you could give some advice to people who are thinking about, I remember I came to you like years ago saying I wanted to do water law, and you were like, "Yeah, do it. Like, there's going to be more and more of it." So, what do you think is something younger people should focus on? Those who want to have a career in water and environmental governance.
Actually, I'm surprised I said that to you. I still do believe that the water world is changing, but my for in order to be a good lawyer, you have to have your basic skill set. It's not just that you know water law, and if you want to practice good water law, you have to know the rest of it, right? In drafting the water law of Sindh, we had to rely on our knowledge of regulatory mechanisms. We had to rely on our knowledge of criminal procedure, because if offense hota hai, it's going to be a criminal trial. And so you have to have a tribunal up, and it has to have criminal procedure and civil procedure. You need to know everything. So if you want to be a water lawyer, and I encourage you to be a water lawyer, you have to practice first. You have to figure out how the courts work, figure out how our laws are written, what the sort of tenor and language that's used, the pressure points. And importantly, as my late father used to tell me, कि जो वकील डेट और बेल नहीं ले सकता ना, वो असली वकील नहीं है. तो आप असली वकील बने पहले. And one of the reasons I feel that I've been successful in environment law, although every time I think I've been successful, I'm reminded that Dr. Pervez Hassan did it 20 years before and did it better. But every time I feel I've done something successful in environmental law, I have benefited from my knowledge and practice of corporate law in the past. It was my ability to, understand the SECP or the Competition Commission and that regulatory framework. You got to be able to crack that legislation and understand it from a systems level. That helps you then in environmental law. Because in environmental law, no two areas are the same. Water law has its entire philosophy. But if you turn to stone crushing, which is an essential ingredient for our construction industry, it's a completely different regulatory mechanism that involves mines and minerals legislation. You need to know that. And then you can practice. I had a client that was in the petroleum business. I had to figure out that system first before I could properly answer. So really, if you want to be a good environment lawyer, you got to practice a bit and get these skill sets first that will really help you then to focus on a particular subject and then leverage your knowledge in other areas to improve the area that you're focusing on.
Thank you. And I think that's very, very helpful, particularly who people for who want to go into the practice of environmental law, and maybe once again start public interest litigation if we're ever permitted to do that. Uh, Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. I think that's a wrap, and we really, really appreciate it. We are going to keep on bugging you for future stuff we do in the environment, in the water governance stuff with the Women in Law initiative. I'd like to thank Nita once again for helping put all of this together and for giving women a platform to have a conversation about this.
I'm just so at some level proud that you guys are doing this, if you know what I mean, and so happy that you're doing it as well. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I did a survey for Chatham House. It was a combined survey of attitudes towards water in South Asia. So we had teams in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal that prepared a survey of almost 100 questions that we asked various sectors of participants or various stakeholders in the water world in each country what their views on water were. And so you can imagine asking 100 questions to 200 people, you get an impossible number of answers. It's very difficult to collect them into some sort of logic, but there were two areas where there was 100% concurrence. Firstly, that we're in a water crisis, and secondly, that there are no women in any serious decision-making positions in the water sectors of Pakistan, none whatsoever. That was in 2014, right? Things are changing now. The Hisar Foundation's sort of Women in Water initiative has been fantastic. Simi Kamal got pissed off because the Sindh Water Policy Board only had men. So within a year, she'd formed a group of over 100 female practitioners in water. You guys should join that as well. Add to the pool. And I'm beginning to see it's I'm getting old, so yeah, I'm not being patronizing. Young women joining water and sanitation agencies and the environment protection agencies as water specialists. So I'm hopeful that the push is working, and in another 5, 10 years, you're going to start seeing a demonstrable change in how people and water governance in Pakistan works. So I remain optimistic. Believe it or not, I remain optimistic.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure as always, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Ji.
Nit.
Have a good